In order to give ourselves an idea of what we'd be doing, we looked at some examples of curriculum maps. Here's one. Here's another example. And another slightly different example. And another example indicating emphasis of particular standards rather than a sequence. And here's an example that might accompany a full curriculum map indicating when teachers are exposing, introducing, focusing, and extending and refining skills and knowledge within particular writing modes, or you could also do this with reading or speaking and listening. Competencies are such a hot topic these days. For the last 5-10 years, we've been hearing more and more about competencies and a move to competencies from standards, and sometimes they're misunderstood. So we spent some time discussing the relationship between standards and competencies. There are a few things that you can think about related to standards versus competencies, and one is the grain size. So the grain size of a competency is bigger than the grain size of a standard. And one of the complaints about standards is that some of them cover just a teeny tiny bit of knowledge or a skill, and some of them are quite a bit bigger and would take many months for a student to master. And so a competency is intended to be a great big idea, something that students should be able to focus on or do long term, a little bit longer term. And then the standards can sort of hang on those competencies. So you can have standards that are just a bit of knowledge alongside and working with and supporting standards that are a little bit bigger in scope. Another thing about competencies is that they are intended to have more of a real-world connection than standards are perceived to have. Some standards, and we know here in Kansas, the teachers worked really hard to try to show in the standards document a real world connection, things that teachers could do to ensure that the standards have a real world connection. But there is this perception that competencies are intended to have more of a real world connection than standards are perceived to have. And then the other advantage for competencies is that they can be cross-curricular in nature. So this is particularly helpful, maybe a little bit easier in elementary school, where students may have the same teacher across many different subject areas, and there can be a competency that's being worked on in several different content areas. It's a little bit more challenging when you get to the secondary grades, where students have, where their subjects are departmentalized. But not impossible still. So there are instances where teachers can work together on a particular competency that stretches across content areas. But those are 3 basic things to keep in mind about competencies. And the state of Kansas recently engaged teachers in developing competencies. And so back in June, we looked at the Navigating Change document, and you can link to that in the Google folder that I developed back in June for everyone. And the Navigating Change document is in there. And the Navigating Change document lists those competencies that teachers developed for different grade bands. So we spent some time talking and thinking about how it might look to have maps organized around competencies. And there was generally support for this idea, but also a little bit of concern that we don't want to miss important things by only looking big picture. So we need to keep in mind that a balance is needed. So we're going to stop again and do a quick knowledge check, and we'll meet back here in a moment.